We are now at the halfway stage in this series, taking a look at the greatest players of the Premier League era in each position, building up to an all-time Premier League 23-man squad and starting 11 as the league celebrates turning 30 years old in 2022. If you are new to either the series or even the entire channel, we have already taken a look at the Premier League's all-time greatest goalkeepers, right-backs, centre-backs, left-backs and defensive midfielders, which means that today is the turn of attacking midfielders. As I pointed out last time out, I am only making 2 central midfield videos for the benefit of the final 11 and 23-man squad, one for defensive and one for attacking midfielders. Of course, some Premier League midfielders are difficult to nail down as having been explicitly more attacking or defensive across the entire course of their careers, and it means that not every player in this 7 is going to be an out-and-out number 10, but I have done my best. I found this to actually be the easiest 7 that I've made in this series, in terms of picking out my strongest 7 from my initial shortlist of about 45 players, but by far the toughest when it came to ordering those 7 from 1 to 7. That is to say, I am very content with my 7, but I am also well aware that the order will strongly divide opinion, which it would do however I rank them, in all fairness. And lastly, a reminder as ever that the criteria throughout this series is a combination of the quality and quantity of a player's performances in the Premier League. That is it. So no, Steven Gerrard will not be punished for never having won the Premier League title. But by the same token, his heroics in Istanbul or in the 2005 Champions League final are also irrelevant to today's video, because, they weren't Premier League performances. Without further ado then, here are, in my opinion, and in my opinion only, the 7 greatest attacking, or just more attacking than defensive midfielders of the Premier League era. 7th, Yaya Touré. When Manchester City signed Yaya Touré in the summer of 2010, it was obvious that they had signed a player of real pedigree, and someone who would help take them up a notch as a team. Having said that, it also seemed as though he would be exerting his influence upon games from defensive midfield, since that is where he had predominantly played at Barcelona, and he even played the entire 2009 Champions League final against Manchester United as a centre-back, keeping a clean sheet no less. Touré had in fact begun his career as a centre-forward though, and he would prove himself at Manchester City to be one of the most versatile and complete players in world football. It was hard to nail Touré down as either an attacking or defensive midfielder for the purpose of this series, since he played in both positions so expertly in the Premier League, quite often within the same game. His very best performances though, and his very best season, which I would rank as one of the greatest single seasons that any player has had in the entire history of the Premier League, came primarily whilst he was playing further forward. The season that I'm referring to is of course the 2013-14 campaign, when he became the first midfielder other than Frank Lampard and arguably Matt Letizia, both of whom also only did it once, to score 20 goals in the Premier League. Touré was virtually unplayable that season, steamrolling opponents both on and off the ball, dragging Manchester City up the pitch, and scoring and creating goals at will. In total, Touré played 230 Premier League games, which is almost a third of the number of Premier League appearances that one player in this 7 racked up, and for that, he is inevitably punished. Nonetheless, the vast majority of those 230 appearances were of the very highest quality, and Touré is, without doubt, one of the 7 finest attacking midfielders, when he played there, that we have seen in the Premier League, so he gets us started. 6th, Kevin De Bruyne. For my money, Kevin De Bruyne is the best midfielder that we have seen in the Premier League, and were this 7 simply ranking the best attacking midfielders of the Premier League era, rather than the greatest, he would take top spot. The only thing holding De Bruyne back, and I really do mean pretty much the only thing, is his lack of appearances in relation to the rest of this 7, and indeed the vast majority of my shortlist. De Bruyne has made 198 Premier League appearances at the time of this recording, 195 of them coming at Manchester City, though he could well have hit the 200 mark by the time that this video comes out. That is the fewest number of Premier League appearances registered by anyone in this 7, and I think I'm right in saying that Trent Alexander-Arnold is the only player to feature in this series who has played fewer. Much like Alexander-Arnold, De Bruyne is the primary creative cog in a world-class team and one of the finest crosses of a ball on the planet. Capable of playing in central midfield or out wide, I think De Bruyne is at his most devastating in something akin to a number 10 position, whilst veering into that right-hand channel where his deliveries are practically lethal. In 7 seasons of Premier League football at the Etihad, De Bruyne has made the PFA Team of the Year thrice, he has been named as the Players' Player of the Year twice, and the Premier League Player of the Season once. Quite simply, a joy to watch, De Bruyne is the most incisive passer of a ball to have played in the Premier League. He very rarely loses the ball, and he frequently produces something quite spectacular. What's more, he provides all of the wizardry and invention of a luxury player, whilst also being a very good athlete, covering plenty of ground and never looking anything like a passenger. In total, De Bruyne has made 80 assists and scored 49 goals in 198 Premier League games. And by the time he hangs up his boots, assuming that he stays in the Premier League for another 3 or 4 years, there is every chance that he will go down as one of the league's greatest players of all time. 5th, Cesc Fabregas. Whilst I think Kevin De Bruyne is a more complete midfielder than Cesc Fabregas, the Spaniard played 350 Premier League games, which is around 150 games more than the Belgian has to date. Fabregas probably ranks among at least the 5 finest teenage footballers of my lifetime, and probably the top 3. And his 2009-10 season is, to my mind, perhaps the most underrated campaign of the Premier League era. Not so much at the time, I don't think, when everyone knew that Fabregas was destined for the bright lights of the Camp Nou, but nowadays, few people give that Arsenal era Fabregas the respect that he, and it, truly deserve. I suspect that is because Fabregas sullied his reputation at Arsenal a little with the 2010 World Cup shirt incident, followed by his move to Chelsea. But there is no partisanship on this channel. Fabregas scored 15 goals and made 13 assists in 27 Premier League games in the 2009-10 season, giving him a record of better than 1 goal contribution per game. Even Frank Lampard never managed that, although he did come very close during that exact same season. An artist with the ball at his feet, Fabregas was already the main man at Arsenal at the age of only 19, and he returned to the Premier League in style with Chelsea in 2014. In his first season back in England, Fabregas came close to eclipsing Thierry Henry's Premier League assist record, putting the ball on a plate for his teammates 18 times as Chelsea lifted the Premier League title. In total, Fabregas made 111 Premier League assists, a tally which is bettered only by Ryan Giggs, who played close to twice as many Premier League games as him. 4th, David Silva. I never have a definitive answer when people ask me what is the finest performance that I've ever seen live and in the flesh, but one of them was certainly David Silva against Hull City at what was then named the Casey Stadium in the 2013-14 Premier League season. I was intrigued then, if not all that surprised, when I saw that Silva picked out that game as his toughest fixture and Hull City as his toughest opponents from his decade at Manchester City when he left the club in 2020. Vincent Kompany was sent off only 10 minutes into that game, and were it not for David Silva, Manuel Pellegrini's side would have been in big trouble. The Spaniard was simply flawless though, barely putting a foot wrong all afternoon, dictating the tempo of the game, scoring a wonderful goal and assisting a second. We tend to think of Silva as being a fairly quiet and unassuming character, but he routinely lifted those around him and, when he needed to, he was always ready to step up and make the difference. Now that he has left Manchester City, more and more stories are starting to come out that lift the lid on the misconception that Silva was a quiet guy, revealing that he was actually a very vocal and charismatic member of the Manchester City dressing room, and he was even pretty lively on a night out. There is very little to critique about Silva's game itself. A magician with the ball at his feet, but also a real workhorse, Silva's work rate was phenomenal, whether he was being played out wide, in central midfield, or as a number 10. In 10 seasons of Premier League football, during which time he played 309 games, Silva hardly ever put a foot wrong. He wasn't as prolific as others in this 7, in terms of his goal scoring, though he still managed to bag 12 goals in his highest scoring campaign, and he has made more Premier League assists than the likes of Steven Gerrard, David Beckham, and Thierry Henry. Silva somehow doesn't seem quite as blockbuster as other all-time Premier League greats. Maybe he just has slightly fewer Hollywood moments to his record, and his achievements came in a team that were often mechanically efficient and suffocated their opponents, but only 3 outstanding midfielders, who all played far more games than him in the Premier League, finish ahead of him in my 7. Third, Steven Gerrard. The top 3 in this 7 was always likely to be the most controversial segment of this entire series, and however I ordered them, I would be irritating someone. I have ranked Steven Gerrard as the 3rd greatest attacking midfielder of the Premier League era, and I will explain why, starting with why he makes a podium finish, before exploring why he doesn't take top spot, which Liverpool fans, and I'm sure many neutrals, will no doubt feel as though he should. Gerrard is probably the single most complete footballer to have played in the Premier League. I don't think that he is the greatest Premier League player in terms of any single attribute, whether that be passing, tackling, technique or finishing, but he was so good at all of them, and many others, that the final product was something really quite special. An inspirational captain, in addition to being a world-class midfielder, Gerrard lifted Liverpool in a way that no other player in this 7 had to lift the standard of their own teams, and in a way that, one doubts, any of the others could. Gerrard proved his range of abilities by playing just off Fernando Torres almost as a second striker and scoring 16 Premier League goals in the 2008-09 season, before dropping much deeper, operating almost as a sweeper at times under Brendan Rodgers, as Liverpool came within inches of lifting the 2013-14 Premier League title. As I said in the introduction, the fact that Gerrard doesn't have a Premier League winners' medal has no bearing on his position in this 7, but the fact that he doesn't have title-deciding moments to his name in the Premier League, like he does in so many other competitions, does. Gerrard was someone who, whilst very consistent, was also capable of producing really spectacular moments which could turn a game in an instant. And were I ranking the top 3 in this 7 beyond just the Premier League, perhaps the order that I've given would be somewhat different. In terms of the numbers, in the Premier League, Gerrard played 504 Premier League games, the joint 11th most of the Premier League era. He made 92 Premier League assists, which is the 7th most of the Premier League era, and he scored 120 Premier League goals, the 19th most, again, of the Premier League era. Gerrard made the PFA Team of the Year 8 times, which is more inclusions than any other top 5 player since 1992, and serves as a very useful reminder of his relentless brilliance in the division, despite failing to get his hands on the trophy itself. Second, Frank Lampard. Statistically, Frank Lampard is the greatest midfielder of the Premier League era. First and foremost, Lampard played far more Premier League games than anyone else in this 7, racking up 609 Premier League appearances in total. That is over 100 more Premier League appearances than his longtime international teammate Steven Gerrard. 429 of Lampard's Premier League appearances came at Chelsea, where he spent the bulk of his career, and indeed his best years, becoming the Blues' all-time top scorer. Meanwhile, he made just shy of 150 Premier League appearances for West Ham United, and exactly 32 appearances during a single season on loan at Manchester City. Lampard is often talked about in terms of his goals from midfield, for obvious reasons, so I shouldn't gloss over them either. Lampard struck 177 times in the Premier League, putting him 5th in the Premier League era scoring charts, ahead of the likes of Michael Owen and Thierry Henry, bearing in mind that Lampard played in midfield. He is also one of only 4 players to make more than 100 assists during the Premier League era, putting him ahead of both Steven Gerrard and Dennis Bergkamp in that regard. It would be wrong to talk about Lampard solely in terms of numbers though. Whilst he was relentless in terms of goal contributions, having worked tirelessly to become so efficient in front of goal, he was also extremely cute and intelligent, both on and off the ball. Some of Lampard's 1- and 2-touch football often gets overlooked, as does the subtlety of his movement, late arrivals into the box, and overlapping runs, particularly in tandem with Didier Drogba. I think a really compelling case could be made that Steven Gerrard was a better all-round midfielder than Frank Lampard, but comparing the two only in terms of quality and quantity of performance in the Premier League, Lampard just edges it for me. First, Paul Scholes. I know that Paul Scholes has become someone that divides opinion, and maybe that is fair enough in regard to his punditry and his Instagram behaviour, but as a footballer, I think that is fairly absurd. The notion that Scholes was not as revered as Lampard and Gerrard during their playing days and that his reputation within the game has been inflated since he retired does not ring true, at least in terms of my own appreciation of Scholes. And it certainly doesn't ring true in terms of others within the game. Throughout his time at Manchester United and with England, it was not a very well-kept secret that Scholes was among the most gifted and important players within the Premier League. A man who made football look very easy. If you talk to anyone who played against Scholes, they'll tell you that, though he was never the quickest, it seemed impossible to get anywhere near him. In his early years, Scholes played in attacking midfield, and almost as a second striker just behind Ruud van Nistelrooy in the early 2000s. In the second half of the 2000s, after Roy Keane left Manchester United and Michael Carrick arrived, Scholes dropped much deeper, becoming the best deep-lying playmaker in the Premier League. At his best, Scholes was as devastating as Lampard whilst playing as a number 10, and as influential as someone like Xavi or Pirlo in terms of collecting the ball off his centre-backs, distributing the ball, and controlling the tempo and rhythm of a game from central or holding midfield. That just shows what a special player Scholes really was. And whilst there are other reasons that I could mention, the simple fact that I think Paul Scholes was a better footballer and a more gifted midfielder dictates the fact that he finishes ahead of Gerrard and Lampard. Albeit, I don't think that there is a fat lot in it, and anyone who suggests that one of them is just miles ahead of the others is being deceptive. It's sometimes said that Scholes being pushed out wide for England is evidence that he was the weakest of the three, but I think that says more, in a negative sense at least, about Sven than it does about Scholes. Between Gerrard, Lampard and Scholes, which has become a borderline obsessive debate now, even after all three have retired, I think Gerrard was the best all-rounder, Lampard was obviously the most prolific and dependable in the final third, and Scholes was the most gifted, and certainly the best in terms of running a game. As I said, I actually think that Kevin De Bruyne is a better player than all three, but comparing them based upon quality and quantity of performances in the Premier League, that is the order that I settled upon. That is it for my 7, but there are a great many honourable mentions that I ought to rattle through as quickly as possible. JJ Okocha and Matt Le Tissier are arguably just as, if not even more gifted than anyone in this 7, along with the likes of Juninho, Mesut Ozil, and even Dimitri Payet, despite not sticking around for long, all of whom provided us with some unforgettable Premier League moments. Current Premier League midfielders, such as Bruno Fernandes and Ilkay Gundogan, are certainly capable of becoming all-time greats, as is Philippe Coutinho, I suppose, if his start to life back in England is anything to go on. Elsewhere, midfielders who made my shortlist but not quite my final 7 included the likes of Aaron Ramsey, Mikel Arteta, Kieran Dyer, Jack Wilshere, Adam Lallana, Dele Alli, Kevin Nolan, Luka Modric, Gary McAllister, Christian Eriksen, Tim Cahill, Gianfranco Zola, Ruud Gullit, Samir Nasri, Juan Mata, Ray Parlour, and Jamie Redknapp, among many others. I think you will agree that they are an eclectic bunch containing a handful of truly outstanding players. But personally, I don't think many of them could stake a really solid claim to crack into my top 7. The order of my 7, on the other hand, would certainly seem to be up for debate to me, and I look forward to hearing all of your views in the comments, especially the abusive ones. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you enjoyed today's video, whether you agree with me or not. Hit the like button if that was the case. I guess hit the dislike button if you just think that I'm an awful human being. If that still exists, did they get rid of that? They might have got rid of that. I'm not very up to date with these things, despite being their job. Also, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on for the channel, and you can find me on social media, on either Twitter or Instagram, by the username at HITC Sevens on both, should you wish to do so.